Hi everybody, shalom, and we're still doing our shiurim from our remote location. I'm sitting in one of the libraries of Yeshivas Or Sameach, which is my day job. I do want to say though that Bezrat Hashem, starting next week, we hope to be back at our regular location in the Beis Knesset on Rehov Yael. People should go to the website YIBONEH, YIBONEH.com, and find the address and the time. So, Bezras Hashem, we will go back to at least somewhat of a live audience. The shir today is dedicated for Refua Shelema, for all whose health has been affected by the war, and of course a special tefillah for success in release of all of the hostages. I would also add that the Chayolim should also be safe, and of course everyone living in the affected area. In addition, a Refua Shelema for Hadassa bat Ria and Denise Hollander, an Aliyat Neshamot for all of those who were recently murdered or died defending the Jewish nation, and I'ilui Neshama of Moshe ben Simbel. Again, we hope that the Zechus of Limud HaTorah should bring Refua, Yeshua, Geula for all of Klal Yisrael, and in addition, an Aliyat Neshamot for those who have left the world. We also have an anonymous sponsorship, once again, that Hashem brings quickly and safely the return of all hostages with complete health to their homes, and for the fast nitzachon of all of our soldiers, so they may all return home with health and victory soon, and that we merit the Geula now. And finally, I and all of YIBONEH want to give special thanks for all those who have contributed to the Tzitzis and Tefillin Fund. We now have 6 pairs of tefillin on the way to the front lines, and of course the tzitzit, so many are needed that we can't even make them fast enough for the demand, which is very great. It's a tremendously wonderful thing that, if there are silver clouds in darkness, obviously, war is something we very much would pray that we shouldn't have. But when it happens, these are opportunities that God opens up that brings the Jewish people together with achdus and with unity and with love and concern. Let me just remind you, it's paled into insignificance now, but if you remember the months before October 7th, the months before Simchas Torah, how the state of Israel was being torn apart by all sorts of dissension, all sorts of machlokas. And now, Baruch Hashem, because of the danger that we face, I think we've put all those differences aside. And among the wonderful things that are happening is the unity, the Avat Yisrael, and also many are returning to God, embracing various mitzvot. And when there's a demand, we have an achrayut, we have a responsibility to meet the supply. And Bezrat Hashem, again, your money can really help in these vital, beautiful projects. Of course, all of us know that we have 3 patriarchs. We have Avraham, we have Yitzchak, and we have Yaakov. But as they say in families, the middle son often gets ignored. So too in the Torah, the middle patriarch has much less space devoted to his life than the other 2. There are several parshiot about Avraham, and of course Yaakov is intimately mixed in with Yosef, and all of Yaakov's life is explained and elaborated upon in great detail. Yitzchak seems to be a bit of an enigma. Although he actually lived longer than any of the others. Yitzchak lived 180 years. Avraham was 175. Yaakov was 147. Yitzchak is 180. And yet we know far less about Yitzchak than we know about any of the other avos. Yitzchak is kind of a mystery person. In many ways, Yitzchak is otherworldly. The experience of the Akedah kind of removed him from normal life. And there are different ways of understanding exactly what is Yitzchak's role. One way of understanding it is that everybody has a different mission in life. Sometimes a person's mission is to innovate, to create, to make something new, to be a mechadesh. Other times, your goal in life or your role in life is to preserve and nurture that which was received and lovingly pass it down to the next generation. So some understand that Avraham Avinu was the great innovator. He created the system of bringing people to God. Right? Everyone who walked into his tent learned about Hashem. And he created a system of what we would call ethical monotheism, would be the modern term that we use. And yes, he was not making everybody Jewish. That wasn't the issue. But the idea of creating Emunah. Yaakov particularizes kind of the Avraham vision into the formation of a nation that becomes Klal Yisrael. These are both innovations. Avraham, you can kind of call him the global innovator. And Yaakov is the creator of the Jewish people as a separate entity. I understand that people commonly say Avraham is the first Jew, but in terms of who is the direct forefather of the Jewish nation, there's no question that it's Yaakov. Indeed, that is why we are called B'nai Yisrael. Yisrael was Yaakov's other name, the children of Israel. Israel is none other than Yaakov, B'nai Yisrael. That's what we're called. So what was Yitzchak's role? Yitzchak's role was B'davka, not to be the innovator, not to be the creator, not to build something new, but to preserve, nurture, protect the legacy of Avram. Sometimes people are bored with that type of responsibility. I mean, all I'm doing is preserving and handing down. Yeah, maybe it is less exciting. Yitzchak certainly traveled less than Avram and Yaakov, right? Yitzchak was not a traveler. He was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. And yet it's vital that when goodness is created, there needs to be something that preserves it. We know in the world that people who are constantly innovating, again, I'm not saying this about Avram, of course, but as a general observation, they go from idea to idea to idea to idea because they're always in a creative modality. They're always in the notion of innovation. But then the original plans that they created fall apart. There's no one that's conserving them. There's no one that's preserving them because I go from this thing to that thing to that thing to that thing. So Yitzchak, kind of as an archetype, represents the importance of preservation and handing it down as a legacy to Yaakov, so Yaakov could do the next stage in creation, the formation of an Am Yisrael, based on the beliefs of Avraham that were handed down and preserved by Yitzchak. So seen in that way, Yitzchak is seen as B'davka, not the innovator, but the one who passes things down by preserving it without deviation. That is kind of one view of Yitzchak. But then we have another view of Yitzchak, which moves in a bit of an opposite direction. And that is, everybody knows the idea of Pirkei Avos, that the world stands on three pillars. Torah, the study of Torah, Avoda, the divine service of korbanos, sacrifices, and prayer, and the third pillar is Gemilos Chesed, acts of loving kindness. And many Meforshim say that the three Avos represent each of these pillars, although in reverse order, which is an interesting question. Avram represents the pillar of loving kindness. Now again, that doesn't mean he didn't have the other ones, but his dominant way of relating to God and relating to people was through loving kindness, chesed. Yaakov, who spent 14 years of intense Torah study in the school of Shem V'Aver before he went to Lavan's house, and we'll talk about that in a few weeks from now, represents the paradigm of Torah study. Yitzchak, who was actually elevated to be a korban in the flesh, is avoda. Seen in this way, it's not simply an issue of Yitzchak preserving the legacy of Avraham, but Yitzchak brought to the forefront a certain aspect of spirituality that was less pronounced in Avram's time. Avram is the yesod of Torah, of Chesed. Yitzchak is the yesod, the foundation of Avodah. Yaakov is the foundation of Torah. In that sense, Yitzchak is a mechadesh as well. He's a mechadesh by literally making himself a korban or becoming designated as a korban. This idea is brought out in a very beautiful way by a famous thought by Rav Simcha Zissel Broidi, who is well known as the Alter, the old man of Kelm. Kelm was a city on the German-Lithuanian border, and there was a yeshiva in Kelm established by the Alter of Kelm in the late 19th century that lasted until the Holocaust. The fame of this yeshiva is that the Alter of Kelm was probably the greatest disciple of Rabbi Yitzchak Hollander. He was a master pedagogue in Musar, in building character, in Midos, a great, great psychologist of the soul. All of the great Musar leaders of the 20th century, virtually all of them, are directly or indirectly disciples of the Alter of Kelm. Even the Alter of Slobodka, who developed very much his own particular approach to Musar and ethical development, was, yes, many people call him a Talmud of Yisrael Salanter, but that's only in a very short time. He was predominantly a Talmud of the Alter of Kelm, although he broke away and had his own independence. Rav Yerucham, Rav Dessler, all of these people come from Kelm. So the Alter of Kelm says an interesting point. Remember that Yitzchak married, beginning of the Parsha, very beginning, Yitzchak marries Rivka when he's 40 years old, and they are married for 20 years. And Rivka does not have a child from Yitzchak. Yitzchak and Rivka have no children. So it says, Vayatar Yitzchak Lashem. Yitzchak prayed to God for his wife, or they both prayed. And the pasuk says that Hashem listened to the voice of Yitzchak, and Rivka got pregnant. And then we have the story of Yaakov and Esav, which is the predominant story in the Parsha. So the question is, if both Yitzchak and Rivka were praying to God, why does the pasuk say that God answered Yitzchak and doesn't say that God answered them both or God answered Rivka? So Rashi brings a medrash that says that Yitzchak is a tzaddik ben tzaddik. Yitzchak is a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik. Rivka is a righteous woman, but she's a tzaddeket bas. I mean, Rashi uses the masculine, tzaddik ben, but it's tzaddeket bas, Rasha. Right? Besuel. So, Eino Daima, the prayer of a tzaddik ben tzaddik, has a much greater effect than the prayer of a tzaddik who comes from a Rasha. And that's why God listened to Yitzchak's prayer and not to Rivka's prayer. So the question people ask on this Rashi and on this Chazal is an obvious question. Logically, we would say exactly the opposite. A person who is righteous and saintly and good and holy, even though they come from a bad, destructive background, deserves a lot more credit than the person who was righteous because they were raised by a righteous person. Just as Chazal say, and the Rambam so paskins, the place where the Baal Tshuva stands, the person who does Tshuva, is higher than the person who never sinned. Then by that same logic, the Tzaddekes, or the Tzaddik who comes from the Rasha, should be held to a much higher level. So why does Hashem listen to the prayer of the Tzaddik ben Tzaddik more than the prayer of the Tzaddik ben Rasha? So Rav Simcha Zissel, the Alter of Kelm, says the following words. The meaning of Tzaddik ben Tzaddik doesn't just mean he's righteous and his father was righteous. If that's all it meant, he would be less than a Tzaddik ben Rasha. But it means that he's a Tzaddik in his own way, despite the fact that his father was a Tzaddik. He doesn't imitate. He finds his own derech. Now, on that level, to be a Tzaddik in your own way, when your father is a tzaddik, is actually a harder and higher madrega than to be a tzaddik, the son of a Rasha. Because when I'm a tzaddik, the son of a Rasha, once I know that I got to live a different life, I know I got to be my own person because I can't follow what came before me. But if you're a son of Avram, what better role model could you have in the world than to simply be another Avram? And yet, Yitzchak was not another Avram. He was a tzaddik with his own derech miyuchad of avoda. Even though his father was a tzaddik, that's even a higher madrega. To be a tzaddik on your own. Which means this views Yitzchak in a different way. In other words, Yitzchak is no longer the passive recipient of Avram who passes down, but we see Yitzchak as a machadesh, an innovator in his own right. And this is an important yesod, by the way, that in our relationship with our children, we need to understand, and this will come back with Yaakov and Esav as well, but just to say it at this point, and that is, on one hand, we have a Masorah. We have a tradition. We have something that goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, and indeed some things go back to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And we're not here to reinvent the wheel. It's not like we're starting anew how to have a relationship with God. We are given the rules. We are given the mitzvos. We are given the belief systems. And my job as a parent is, like Yitzchak with Avram, to hand down and preserve the legacy that I was given. At the same time, we have to give our children the tools to become the individuals that express the uniqueness of their personality. Hashem does not want cookie cutter, homogeneous imitators. Hashem wants us within the framework of the commonality of Messiah to develop our own uniqueness, to be tzaddikim, b'nei tzaddikim, and not to simply be a blind carbon copy of what came before us. And that's a big challenge, in a sense, like many, many things. It's difficult to navigate those two polarities, You can have an attitude that each generation must rediscover the truth for itself. But then you don't have a religion, you don't have a community. Everybody's marching to their different drummer. It reminds me of a joke. I think maybe it may be a true story, that a bunch of anarchists wanted to have a convention in Seattle, but like nobody showed up at the same time because you're an anarchist. You don't listen to rules. So everybody's doing their own thing. How are you going to have a meeting? Like nobody's going to come. You can't tell me what to do, and the like. So obviously, there has to be a framework. There has to be a commonality. But then you have people who are just going to be mechanical tin soldiers, just marching as everybody's exactly the same, dressed the same, thinking the same. That's no good either, right? So how do you develop? This is the challenge. I don't even have the answer, but this is the challenge and the goal. How do you develop creativity and individuality within the framework of transmitting a Messiah that doesn't change? But these are kind of two views of Yitzchak. And the truth is, you actually see these two dimensions of Yitzchak in the story of the well, which is actually a fascinating story. It's not going to be the main theme I'm going to talk about, but it's interesting. On one hand, the Torah emphasizes that Yitzchak dug the wells, because remember, the Philistines, after Avram's death, filled up Yitzchak's wells. He was a victim of harassment. They didn't want him around. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the 400 years of slavery and estrangement begin from the birth of Yitzchak, because already in Yitzchak's life we see he's being pushed around, even in Eretz Yisrael. So on one hand, the Torah emphasizes these were the wells of Avraham, and Yitzchak called them by the same names as his father. Now, you might think, well, that's not a significant fact. I mean, if Yitzchak just didn't have the energy to make up new names, then don't say anything. Like, why is it important to say? In fact, we don't even know what those names were. We don't even know what names Avraham, right? Why is it important to say he called them by the names of his father? The answer is, this wasn't a matter of laziness. This is a description of his mission. His mission is to preserve what Avraham Avinu did. And therefore he said, I'm not innovating. I'm not creating something new. I'm not inventing anything. I am preserving. I am nurturing. I am simply re-establishing what it was that my father did. And again, let me remind you that wells generally are symbolic of divine knowledge and wisdom and Torah. So the whole idea of a be'er is connected that way. Now, but then we are told that Yitzchak did dig some new wells. And these wells were given unique names. One well was dug, and the Philistines fought him over it, and that was called Asek. Asek means quarrelsome. Another well was dug, and they fought over that, and that was called Sitna, which means hatred. And a third well was dug, and finally they made peace with it. The Philistines didn't fight it. That was called Rehovot. God has given me expanse, right? The city of Rehovot is named after that pasuk. So here already we see innovation. We see creativity. And indeed the Ramban writes that the three wells are remazim to the three Batei Mikdash. Two of them we've had and we've lost, and one, B'ezrat Hashem, we're going to have when Mashiach comes. The first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed primarily because of idolatry. It says idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder, but Avodah Zarah was the big one. That's called Asek. Asek is fighting with God. Avodah Zarah is called Asek. The second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by the Romans because of Sinat Chinam, hatred, polarization, disunity among the Jewish people, and that is called Sitna, hatred. The third Mikdash, we have a divine promise, will never be destroyed. Right? It's Nigzar that the Beis HaMikdash will be destroyed twice. Once we have the third Mikdash, it will be forever. And that's why it is called Rechovot, expansiveness, and the like. So the Ramban says that the Ma'isa Avos Simin Labanim, everything the Avos do, is a sign to what will happen to us in the future. And this is Yitzchak as innovator and creator, right? So you see the two faces of Yitzchak in the story of the well. Now, but as I say, the amount of psukim, the amount of space that Yitzchak is given is very, very small, and it's almost like he's a placeholder for the story of Yaakov and Esav. Then we have the birth of Yaakov and Esav, and they're twins. Right? Twins, you would expect Bedavka to be very similar, and yet they physically look very different. And almost immediately, we don't have a year-by-year diary, but almost immediately, they seem to pursue different types of interests. That Esav is a hunter, and Yaakov is a Yoshev Ohel, a person who sits in the tents learning Torah. Again, I threw out for a question, what did it mean exactly to learn Torah? I can tell you for sure, he wasn't opening a Gemara and learning a Taisus. Those things weren't written yet. Whatever Torah means exactly, whether it's the 7 Noahide laws, whether it's what you might call Kabbalah, in other words, mystic understandings of God, but Yaakov was involved in spiritual pursuits. And then we read about how Yaakov was cooking lentils, and Esav comes back from the hunt hungry, and Yaakov purchases Esav's firstborn rights for a pot of lentils, which are red, and that's why another name for Esav is Edom, the red one, both because he had a red complexion and because he gave up the Bechorah for lentils. Now, that story, when did that story occur? So Rashi makes a very interesting cheshbon that Yaakov and Esav were 15 years old when that story occurred. Where do you get the 15 years old? Because the tradition is that Yaakov is cooking lentils because lentils is food that you give a mourner, a person, right? Our minhag is we don't do lentils so much, we do hard-boiled eggs, but the same reason, that you give a mourner for the first meal something oval or something round. And the idea is as if to comfort him by saying that fate changes. There are bad times, but then the wheel turns and there are good times. So it could be lentils, it could be eggs. Now, Yaakov is cooking mourner food to give to his father. Why is Yaakov cooking mourner food to give to his father? Because Avram Avinu died right then. Now, let's figure this out. We know that Yitzchak was born when Avraham was 100. We know that Yaakov was born when Yitzchak was 60. If Yaakov and Esav were born when Yitzchak was 60, Yaakov and Esav were born when Avram was 160. If the lentils are being cooked when Avram died, and Avram died at 175, ergo, right, simple mathematics tells me that Yaakov and Esav, who are twins, were 15 years old. Chazal make an interesting observation that until that day, even though Esav was a hunter, he was not publicly a sinner or publicly a rasha till the day that he sold Yaakov the birthright. And this was part of God's blessing to Abraham, that he would not see any of his children be Rishaim, even Yishmael. Yishmael did Shuvah before he died, and Esav did not become an open rasha until Avram died. And most understand this. This is like God's gift to Avram, that he will not see his descendants. He will not leave the world seeing his descendants sin. I've always thought, though, and again, I don't have a source, just a feeling I have, that I think there's a psychological dimension here. That Avram was the grandparent. Maybe I'm using modern categories, but Avram was the Zaidi that gave Esav a sense of belonging. Because in many, many ways, you would imagine that even if Esav wasn't a rasha, he wasn't learning in the Beis HaMedrash, he wasn't steiging, he was osek in hunting. That's not a nachas for Yitzchak and Rivka, you see? And again, these are real scenarios. Imagine you have a family, and one kid is like the best kid in yeshiva. And the other kid is a nice kid, but he likes to play baseball, likes to play basketball. You know, it's very hard, as much as parents want to love all of their children. It's very hard sometimes to have the same feelings. So, the kid who's not quite mainstreamed in the yeshiva world might feel marginalized, might feel rejected. Well, again, this is speculation. Maybe Esav had that sense of rejection. What compensated for that sense of rejection was the relationship he had with his Zaidi Abraham. And indeed, in real life, you often see that a grandfather can connect to a rebellious child in a way that the parents are not able to connect. So the notion that Esav became a rasha the day Avram died might be understood as not simply the idea that Hashem protected Avram from bad news, but quite literally, Esav lost his support system. Esav lost the one adult who believed in him, the one adult that gave him strength. So in some ways, Esav indeed, in our tradition, morphed into a rasha, although, by the way, in the Chumash itself, you don't necessarily see that. In other words, if I ask you, show me in the Chumash where we see Esav as an evil person. We see Esav as somebody who is very hurt and who even wants to kill Yaakov, but on the other hand, there are reasons for that. In other words, you don't really see, Amalek is Esav's descendant, but you don't see the radical, irrational, total hatred of Amalek in Esav itself, directly in the text. But nevertheless, our Masorah is that Esav, indeed, became a rasha, but perhaps it is connected to losing his support system in the world, which is something we need to think about as well. So what was the Bechira, right? So Yaakov bought the Bechira with a pot of lentils. What exactly did he buy? So all the Meforshim say that this was not a matter of money. This has nothing to do with double portion of inheritance or anything else. But rather, before there was a Mishkan, before there was a Beis HaMikdash, the firstborn of every family was designated to be the Kohen, to be the priest who would bring korbanos. This was a zechus to officiate, so to speak, in spiritual worship. Esav said, I don't need it, I don't want it. In the language of the Torah, Vayivez Esav es habechorah. Esav despised it. And what did Esav... See, people look at this as, oh, Yaakov took advantage of a starving man by taking away something really, really precious. The Torah tells me that Esav did it because this meant nothing to him. Quite literally, the beans were more important to him than the Bechira. So, when he says, Hine anochi holech lamos, behold, I'm going to die. Why do I need a Bechorah? So some people understand it that, he's on the verge of, they make Yaakov look bad. He's on the verge of death. He's going to drop dead if he doesn't eat anything. So you're taking it, I'll give you food if you sell me your Bechorah. Yeah, if you look at it that way, I'm going to drop dead, then essentially Yaakov got it by coercion. But there's another way of looking at it. Esav is not saying I'm going to drop dead. This is a philosophical statement. Behold, after I die, that's it. There is no spiritual life. There's no olam haba. There's no future. So what's the point of serving God? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we will die. Hine anochi, it doesn't mean I'm going to die now. I'll die in 50 years. But it's the same point. Hine anochi holech lamos. Lama zeli b'chora. I don't need it. So there's no taking advantage here. Quite literally, Esav says, I don't need it. It's not worth anything to me. Question. Think about the question. Well, were Yitzchak and Rivka aware of this sale? Because after all, this is a public event. If the Bechor is the one who brings korbanos or whatever it is, so that means Yaakov is going to be the guy doing it, not Esav. So wouldn't this be something that Yitzchak and Rivka would note, right? They would know, right? Because this is not a secret thing. The Chumash doesn't say, and this will tie into the next event in the life of Yaakov and Esav. The next event occurs many, many, many years later. It occurs, and Rashi gives you a very complicated chronology, which I'm not going to go over, but it's based on the Gemara in Megillah. Yaakov and Esav are 63 years old. And that means Yitzchak is 123. Now this is fascinating. Yitzchak lives to 180. Yitzchak is going to live many, many more years. But Yitzchak thinks he's about to die. The whole story of the blessings is many, many decades before Yitzchak dies. Right? You wouldn't get that impression from the Chumash. You get that impression that he's about to die. He lives many years. In fact, he's alive when Yosef is sold. But for whatever reason, Yitzchak thinks he wants to die. And Yitzchak wants to give a special blessing to his son Esav. And he sends Esav to go hunt and bring back something that he could eat. And then he will give Esav a special bracha. And Rivka overhears this. Now remember, Rivka is this is not like Sarah Hagar. Sarah is not Yishmael's mother. Rivka is Esav's mother. But still, she doesn't want Esav to get the brachos. So this is the famous scene, where Yaakov impersonates Esav. He wears the goat skins to have the hairy arms. He wears, Esav also had special garments that helped him in his hunting. These were garments he got from Nimrod that would attract animals. Why wasn't Esav wearing these garments? Rivka didn't give it to him at that particular time. And Yitzchak, apparently thinking he's blessing Esav, actually blesses Yaakov. And then when Esav shows up a little late, Yitzchak kind of says, too late, I already gave it away. Now, there are so many questions on this story. I always like to say that this is one of the great proofs that the Torah comes from God. Because if we were writing our own story, we would certainly not write a story like that. In other words, if you say the Jewish people wrote the Torah, they're not going to write that the whole bracha that Yaakov got from Esav, from Yitzchak, was a matter of fraud, misrepresentation. So the Torah comes from God, so God gives you the truth, no matter what. But let's break it down into a few discrete questions. We're not going to be able to answer all of them. Question one is, what was Yitzchak thinking? Did Yitzchak think, truly, that Esav was better than Yaakov, that Esav deserved the blessing more than Yaakov? Now, some learned, well, yeah, Yitzchak was blind from the Akedah. The angels, cried and they blinded him, and some say the blinding meant even spiritually he could not perceive duplicity, hypocrisy. He could be fooled in various ways. But here's the kasha. There are 100% textual indicators that Yitzchak was fully aware that Esav was not a righteous man. Number one, right before this story, it mentions that Esav took Canaanite wives. And this was a source of bitterness to Yitzchak and Rivka. To Yitzchak and Rivka. So Yitzchak knows Esav is violating the commitment of Avraham Avinu not to marry Canaanite women. That's one indicator. A second indicator is that when Yaakov brings Yitzchak the goats, supposedly the product of Esav's hunting, and Yitzchak says, I want to feel your arms. And Yitzchak feels the hairy arms. So he says the famous pasuk that's become a famous statement, Hakol kol Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. Hayodayim, but the hands, the arms, are the hands of Esav. By the way, Chazal have a beautiful drasha, and that is, Yaakov's power in all generations is the voice of prayer, the voice of Torah. Esav's power is physical brutality. Yaakov's power, again, needless to say, we of course need an army, and I need to say this, and we need to be profoundly grateful to all of the chayolim that risk their lives to protect Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael. And Hashem should bless them in all ways. But we also know that although we must have an army, because that's part of what is called tishtadlus, the human effort that we need, the ultimate source of victory comes from Torah and Tefillah, based on this idea, Kol Kol Yaakov, Vayadayim Yidei Esav. So that's a drasha, that's an interpretation Chazal has. That's a very important interpretation, especially now. But let's go back to the simple meaning of the verse. What does it mean the voice is the voice of Yaakov? So Rashi says it doesn't mean that Yaakov's voice was different than Esav's voice. Yaakov's voice was the same. They're twins. Their voices were the same. But it means that Yaakov would use the name of Hashem in his conversation. Baruch Hashem. Esav never used the name of Hashem. And since Yaakov said, God has blessed me, etc., so Yitzchak is saying, that's not the way Esav talked. So what do you see from that? That, again, Yitzchak knows that Esav doesn't use Shem Shamayim. So he knows Yaakov is righteous. The third point goes back to my earlier point, which I don't have a proof of, and that is, if Yaakov bought the Bechira so many years earlier, it must have been Yitzchak and Rivka were aware of it. So once again, they're aware of the fact, although I don't have a proof, but I think B'Pashas, they're aware of the fact that Yaakov purchased the Bechira because Vayiva is Esav as HaBechira. So for all of these reasons, the fact that Esav married a Canaanite woman, the fact that Esav doesn't use Shem Shamayim, and the fact that Vayiva is Esav as HaBechira, it's a davar pashat that Yitzchak was not fooled. Yitzchak understood that Yaakov is the more righteous son. So why would Yitzchak want to give a special blessing to his son Esav? So the Malbim, Rav Hirsch, the Netziv, with different variations, they all have a very similar idea. And that is, Yitzchak knows that Yaakov is the tzaddik. Yitzchak knows that Yaakov will be the one who will carry on the legacy of Avraham and establish a Jewish nation. But at the same time, Yitzchak loves Esav. This is his son. He wants to make something good out of Esav's life. Esav is a hunter. Esav doesn't learn. Esav doesn't do all sorts of good things, but he's a hunter, and Esav has many talents. Esav can organize. Esav can get things done. So Yitzchak has devised a plan. This is a plan that's somewhat similar to a plan that Yaakov's sons devised later. And this is the famous Yisachar Zevulun arrangement. And that is, Yisachar was a tribe that was totally devoted to Torah study. Zevulun were engaged in commerce and business, although they had to learn Torah too, but that wasn't their main activity. So Zevulun supported the work of the learning of Yisachar, and therefore they became partners, they became shutfim in all of Yisachar's Torah learning. Now Yaakov figures the following. Hashem promised us that we will get Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is our land. But when we eventually get Eretz Yisrael as a nation, there's a lot of stuff you got to do. You got to dig wells. You got to plant fields. You got to have businesses. You got to have law firms, accounting firms, stores. Now, maybe this would take Yaakov away. Yaakov is one who learns Torah, teaches Torah. I don't want Yaakov to be so tarud, so preoccupied in building a society and fighting wars and establishing an army. So let's have a division of labor. Let's give Eretz Yisrael, because that actually is the bracha of Yitzchak. I will give Eretz Yisrael to Esav. He will run the government, he will run the army, he will dig the ditches, he will plant the fields, he will build the infrastructure of society. And he will use his resources for the benefit of Yaakov. And this is a great deal for Yaakov and a great deal for Esav. It's a great deal for Yaakov because this will free Yaakov from all of the anxieties and preoccupation in building a society. That Yaakov can focus totally on ruchnius, on spirituality, on Torah, on transmitting Torah. And it's a great deal for Esav, because Esav is never going to be somebody that's going to sit in the Beis Medrash. Esav is going to be a person who has to be out there in the world and get things done. But let me give him a channel where he will connect and use his considerable abilities in a good way. This is the plan of a loving father who understands that even though both of my two children have gone on different paths, I even want the wayward child to find a way to use his abilities in a good way. This is so now. Well, Yitzchak indeed is fooled because Esav is not capable of this at this point. But he's fooled on a much more subtle level. He's not fooled in the simplistic way. Oh, I think Esav is such a tzaddik because he asks me such involved halachic shaylas. No, he knows who Esav is. But he thinks Esav can have his redemption in that particular way. Now, it's interesting that this may be a tikkun, an attempted rectification of something that happened many, many, many years before. And whenever I say this thought, I always get criticized, but it's from Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So, if you have a problem, it's Rav Hirsch, not me, that it just mentions, Vayigdalu hana'arim, the young boys were growing up, and Esav became a hunter, and Yaakov became Yoshev Ohel, a dweller in tents. Rav Hirsch says, the key reason why their paths diverged was because Yitzchak and Rivka tried to raise them identically. People take twins, they dress them the same. Meaning, they took both of them, put them in the base medrash, so to speak. Using it metaphorically, and say, you got to learn 12 hours a day. But Esav needed basketball. Esav needed to play. Esav needed to run around. Rav Hirsch says, when you try to make an Esav into a Yaakov, not only will you not get a Yaakov out of him, you will not get the good Esav that you might have gotten. Suffice it to say, I think we see this in families literally every day. And this is what Shlomo HaMelech said in Mishlei. Chanoch l'nar al pi darko. You must educate a child according to their personality. It's not a one-size-fits-all. We have to be able to accommodate the individualities of people, to be able to steer them in ways that their talents can find a recognition and find an outlet within Masorah, within mitzvahs. So what's interesting is, if, as Rav Hirsch explains, the original mistake, and again, some people say you shouldn't talk about the Avos that way, but I'm just using Rav Hirsch for the idea. If the original mistake of Yitzchak and Rivka is Vayigdalu hana'arim, Yitzchak is trying to correct that now. I now recognize that Esav is fundamentally different. He needs a different derech, a different hadracha. I'll give him a country. I'll give him the land. I'll give him society. I'll give him business and commerce and agriculture. And he'll use it for Yaakov. So what's the mistake with that? The mistake is, as we tragically say, too little, too late. Had this been done when the boys were 15, it might have worked. But now, the boys are no longer little boys. 63 years old. Esav is set in his ways. Esav has been, in a sense, broken. Rivka knows this. So there is a naivete on the part of Yitzchak, but it's a subtle daka stick, as we say, naivete. Rivka, who grew up in a home of liars and duplicity, did indeed have a superior ability to unearth hypocrisy and the like. In that sense, Yitzchak was not as good as Rivka in that. By the way, the Netziv has a very interesting point. Again, these are kind of modern ideas, but the Netziv mentions it. Look at the difference between, Avram and Sarah had a problem kid, Yishmael, and Yitzchak and Rivka have a problem kid, Esav. But look at the difference. When Avram and Sarah have a problem kid, Yishmael, Sarah just says directly, you got to send him away. Sarah is direct. Sarah is open. Sarah communicates. Rivka has to engage in a deception. Why doesn't she talk to Yitzchak directly? So the Netziv points out that the communication of Yitzchak and Rivka was not as good as Avram and Sarah. Avram and Sarah were like equal. With Yitzchak and Rivka, number one, on the most simple level, there's a tremendous difference of age. Yitzchak was 40 when Rivka was only 3, according to Chazal, according to Rashi. Number two, because Yitzchak had reached the supreme elevation of an Akedah, he was like a holy man. It actually says Rivka was afraid of him. I don't mean afraid that he would hurt her, but she was in awe of him. she was in awe of her husband. And therefore she felt she could not bring up things directly. She wanted Yitzchak to understand, because the way it works is, see, this goes to another question. People say, well, if Yitzchak thought he was blessing Esav, I mean, this is not like a magic spell. Oh, no, you got the ray gun. I mean, Yitzchak was blessing Esav. The fact that this guy in front of him is Yaakov, that doesn't change anything. But the answer is that Yitzchak understood when Esav came back. And Yitzchak felt the presence of Gehenna. When he said, Gam Baruch Yiyah, he shall be blessed, Yitzchak at the end agreed. He saw min hashamayim that this is the way it had to be. So Yitzchak indeed said the brachos belong to Yaakov. So the point basically is that Yitzchak, it's a very touching story in a sense. You know, a parent never stops loving their child. Yitzchak loved Esav. I assume that even Rivka loved Esav, although you don't necessarily see that from the narrative. But Yitzchak actually felt that maybe he had shortchanged Esav all those years. With her first, Vayigdalu Hana'arim. This was his attempt to make it up. Now, here's what the Malbim adds. That's why, this is really a very interesting point. That is why the bracha that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov when he thought he was Esav was not the same bracha that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov when he knew it was Yaakov. The bracha that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov when he thought he was Esav is a bracha only in Gashmias. V'yitein l'cha Elokim. God should give you dew, God should give you parnasa, God should give you grain. The bracha he gives later to Yaakov is, God should give you the covenant that was made with Avram of spiritual mission. So says the Malbim, it's very medoyak in the Psukim. The spiritual mission would never have been given to Esav to begin with. That was always going to be Yaakov's blessing. Yitzchak's cheshbon was the bracha of Gashmias of Eretz Yisrael, that we're going to give. That we're going to give to Esav. And that's the one that Rivka realized, that if you gave it to Esav, he wouldn't use it for Yaakov's benefit. He would use it to afflict Yaakov, to dominate Yaakov. Right? So that's the idea, that there are two brachos here. There's a bracha on inyonim of Olam Hazeh, and then there's the bracha of the Abrahamic mission of godliness and kedusha. That bracha Yitzchak would have always given to Yaakov. Even had Esav gotten the first bracha, Yaakov would have given Yaakov that second bracha. This is a point that the Malbim says. Now, it is interesting that there's another point Rav Hirsch adds to all of this, and that is, again, there's so many questions. What about the deception? I mean, good. So we explained what Yitzchak thought and how Yitzchak was deceived. But why? But Yaakov Lamaisa is getting things through Sheker. So Rav Hirsch says this is part of the process, because part of why Yitzchak doesn't want to give Yaakov the material blessings is because he says, you're a tam, you're a simple person, meaning you're a holy person. You don't understand lies. You don't understand duplicity. When you're in the political world, everything is sheker. Let Esav handle the lies. So Yaakov has to show Yitzchak that when it's necessary, he knows how to lie as well. So not that he will lie in the future, but if you know how to lie, you won't be taken in by lies. Meaning he's basically showing, I'm capable of living in this world, because I'm capable of engaging in this deception when that's necessary. So this is a fascinating point, but there's a final point that the Medrash makes that's a very, very powerful one. And it says, okay, so Esav should have got the blessings, and Yaakov got it instead, right? Or Yitzchak intended that Esav should get the blessings, Yaakov gets it. Well, what did Yaakov really get? The truth of the matter is, the Medrash says the ultimate blessings of complete rule over Eretz Yisrael are not going to be realized until Mashiach. I mean, as we can see even now. Yeah, maybe there's a state of Israel, Baruch Hashem, but complete rule, peaceful rule. And what about all the years of Gullus and persecution? And Yaakov's own life. As a result of the deception he practiced against Esav, he became vulnerable to all of the deception of Lavan over 20 years, with Rachel and Leah and with the sheep. And Mechiras Yosef. I mean, look at all the deceptions that Yaakov was victimized by. He worked 7 years to marry Rachel, and he gets Leah. He gets cheated with the sheep over and over again. For 22 years, he thinks Yosef is gone. It's a mida keneged mida. You got a bracha by Ramaut, by deception. You will suffer by deception. Chazal even say that when Esav comes in after Yaakov got the brachas, and he hears that Yitzchak gave it away already, and Yitzchak knows that he can't give it to Esav now because he feels the presence of Gehenna there. So the pasuk says, "Vayizak za'aka gedailu mara." Esav cried a loud and bitter cry. And Chazal say, this is before you had computers that could check this, that there's only one other place in Tanakh where that expression appears, and that is in Megillas Esther, when Mordechai hears of the Gezerah of Haman. Vayizak za'aka gedailu mara. And what do Chazal say? As a punishment or as a consequence of Yaakov making Esav have a loud and bitter cry, a descendant of Esav, Haman, who comes from Agag, who comes from Amalek, who comes from Esav, causes Mordechai, a descendant of Yaakov, to have Za'aka Gedailu Mara. Now, clearly it doesn't mean this was a punishment. Why would there be a punishment? Yaakov was doing what he had to do. But this is a consequence, meaning when you engage in sheker and deception and you hurt people, it's going to come back and bite you. It's like a law of spiritual nature. It's not a punishment. I mean, the example would be, if I dive into a fire to save a baby, I did a wonderful thing. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to get burnt. And the same way, there are physical laws of nature. There are spiritual laws of nature. The pain that you cause others will come back to haunt you. Sometimes you got to make a decision. I got to cause that pain. Eino chinami. But think twice before you do that, because people always say l'shem shamayim, I'm doing everything for the sake of heaven. That's not going to protect you necessarily from the consequences. Let me just mention one other point that the Sifrei Chasidus say. They say a very beautiful thing, that in giving the bracha that Yitzchak thinks he's giving to Esav, but is in reality giving it to Yaakov, Yitzchak calls him my son 8 times. Beni, 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 Beni. So one of the Sifrei Chasidus draws a beautiful parallel, that we see this with David HaMelech. When Avshalom, who was the son who wanted to kill David HaMelech, was killed. Remember what happened? He had beautiful long hair that got caught in a tree. He's riding a donkey. And Yoav, who is David's general, has Avshalom killed. And David didn't want that. And David mourns and cries and says, Avshalom beni. He actually says, why couldn't I die instead of you? And Chazal say, why did he say beni 8 times? Because he brought him up. There are 7 chambers of Gehenna, deep levels. Each beni brought him out of one chamber. So the 7 benis brought him out of Gehenna, and the 8th got him to Olam Haba. It says Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, everyone has a favorite place they want to daven. So they daven the Kotel, Makam Kadesh, the Orach Chaim's kever, or whatever it is. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz's favorite place to daven was a place called Yad Avshalom. If you know, in Nachal Kidron, in the valley before the Mount of Olives, there are a bunch of small monuments. And one of those monuments is said to be the monument of Avshalom. Now, the truth is, it's probably erroneous. I believe it was called that by the Crusaders. But some had a belief that this is where Avshalom is buried. So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz liked to daven by Yad Avshalom. Now you might think, why should that be an auspicious makom of tefillah? Avshalom was a Rasha who wanted to kill his father. Says Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, because I can come to Hashem and say, in this place, or on this person, David HaMelech, who Avshalom wanted to kill, prayed and davened and was mavakesh rachamim, that a father has rachamim on his son, even when a son wants to kill him. So I say to Hashem, no matter how bad we are, you're our father. Have rachamim. Remember David's rachamim over Avshalom. That's beautiful, right? So Yad Avshalom was a very a beautiful makom tefillah for him in that way. Karachem of al banim. So now it says the following. It says that when Yitzchak smelled the garments of he thought Esav was right, but really it was Yaakov, right? So it says, "Vayarach es reach begadav," and it had the smell of Gan Eden, an apple garden, etc. But Chazal say, begadav can also be read bogdav. Bogdav are treacherous, rebellious people. Yitzchak may not have known who's standing in front of him. Is it Esav or is it Yaakov? But at that moment, he did have a view that from this person will come Shrek lecha rishayim, even from Klal Yisrael, even from the Jews. And therefore, Yitzchak said B'ni 8 times to take them out of Gehenna and bring them to Olam Haba. The same idea as David and Avshalom is what Yaakov was doing in Vayarach es reach begadav, al tikri begadav ela bogdav. And Chazal actually say, this is a reference specifically to 2 Jewish people who were Rishayim and collaborators with the Romans at the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, that even they eventually should do tshuva and be zocha to Olam Haba. Okay, so these are some thoughts that we can think about. Again, may all of our learning, may the learning of all of Klal Yisrael be a zechus for Eretz Yisrael, for the Chatufim, for the people who are tragically still being held hostage, for the Chayolim, for Am Yisrael. May this be a precursor to the Geula Shelema b'mheira v'yameinu. YIBONEH